Science tells us that the human skeleton is incredibly resilient. To reduce human bone to ash, a fire must burn at a consistent temperature of 2000 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 2 hours. Even then, fragments usually remain. Yet, on Christmas morning in 1945, in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, the impossible supposedly happens. A house fire, which burned for only 45 minutes, allegedly vaporized 5 children so completely that not a single tooth or bone shard was ever found. This is not just a story about a fire, it is a story about a kidnapping, a cover-up, and a family that spent a lifetime staring into the dark, waiting for children who never came home. To understand the tragedy, we must first look at the family. George and Jenny Sodder were the embodiment of the American immigrant dream. George had come from Sardinia, Italy, and through sheer grit, built a successful trucking business. They had 10 children and lived in a large 2-story timber home. But George was not a quiet man. He was vocal about his politics, and in the Italian-American community of the 1940s, he made enemies by openly criticizing Benito Mussolini. This was a dangerous stance to take. In the months leading up to Christmas 1945, the family received ominous warnings. A stranger appeared at the back door looking for work, warning George that his fuse boxes will cause a fire someday. George was confused. The house had just been rewired and inspected. Weeks later, another man trying to sell life insurance became irate when George declined. He pointed a finger at the house and shouted, "Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." The older Sodder sons also reported seeing a car parked on the highway for days, watching the younger children come home from school. The pieces were being set for a nightmare. On Christmas Eve, the house was full of joy. The war was over and the older boys were back from the service. The atmosphere was festive. Marion, the eldest daughter, bought gifts for everyone. The younger children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, begged to stay up late to play with their new toys. Jenny agreed, allowing them to stay up as long as they did their chores. She took the youngest, Sylvia, upstairs to bed. At 12:30 a.m., the phone rang. Ginny rushed downstairs to answer it so it wouldn't wake the house. On the other end was a woman's voice she didn't recognize, asking for a name she didn't know. In the background, there was the sound of clinking glasses and raucous laughter, as if a party were going on. When Ginny said, "You have the wrong number," the woman laughed, a strange, sharp laugh, and hung up. Ginny found the interaction unsettling. As she walked back to the stairs, she noticed 2 things. The lights were still on, and the curtains were unlocked. She locked up, assumed the children had gone to sleep in the attic room, and went back to bed. 30 minutes later, she was jolted awake again, this time by a sound on the roof. It was a loud bang, followed by a rolling noise, like a heavy rubber ball tumbling down the shingles. She stayed quiet for a moment. Then she smelled the smoke. George and Ginny reacted instantly. They grabbed the 4 children sleeping on the first floor and ran out into the freezing snow. They yelled up the stairs to the attic where the other 5 children slept, but the staircase was already a wall of flame. They were trapped outside. It was in these frantic moments that the theory of accident falls apart. George, desperate to save his children, ran to grab his tall ladder, which was always kept against the side of the house. It was gone. It was later found days later, dragged away and hidden in a muddy ditch. George didn't stop. He ran to his 2 coal trucks, planning to back them up to the house and climb on top to reach the attic window. These trucks had functioned perfectly earlier that day. Now, neither of them would start. He cranked the engines until his hands bled, but they were dead. He tried to use the water from the rain barrel, but it was frozen solid. The family stood helpless in the snow, screaming the names of their children as the roof collapsed in with a roar. By 2:00 a.m., just 45 minutes after the smoke was smelled, the house was a pile of ash. The fire department didn't arrive until 8 a.m. the next morning. despite being only 2.5 miles away. By the time they began to sift through the ash on Christmas morning, George and Jenny braced themselves for the horror of finding their children's remains. But they found nothing. The coroner and the fire chief, F.J. Morris, were quick to declare that the fire had been hot enough to incinerate the bodies completely. They issued death certificates for the 5 children, citing fire or suffocation. But the Sodders knew this was physically impossible. In the ashes, they found kitchen appliances that were twisted but recognizable. They found a dictionary that was scorched but readable. How could a fire leave a dictionary intact but turn 5 human skeletons into dust? As the shock wore off, the Sodders began to investigate. A telephone repairman told them that their phone line hadn't been burned through by the fire, it had been cut at the top of the pole. Someone had climbed up and severed it. A witness, a bus driver, claimed to have seen balls of fire being thrown onto the roof, explaining the rolling sound Jenny heard. Then came the sightings. A woman at a roadside diner 50 miles away claimed she had served breakfast to the missing children the morning after the fire. She noted there was a car with Florida license plates parked outside. Another woman at a Charleston hotel claimed the children had stayed there a week after the fire with 2 men and 2 women of Italian extraction who stopped her from talking to the kids. The corruption of the investigation became undeniable 2 years later. George Sodder was so persistent that Fire Chief Morse admitted to burying a box of remains at the site to comfort the family. When George dug up the box and sent the contents to a pathologist, the report came back. It was a fresh beef liver. The fire chief had planted animal organs to make the family believe the children had died simply to close the case. Why go to such lengths? Why cut the phone lines? Why disable the trucks? Why hide the ladder? Refusing to rebuild, George and Jenny turned the site of their home into a memorial garden. They erected a massive billboard on Route 16 with pictures of the 5 children and a reward of $5,000, later increased to $10,000. For decades, the billboard stood as a haunting landmark, staring down every driver who passed through Fayetteville. The family chased leads across the country. George traveled to St. Louis, to New York, and to Texas, following whispers. He never found them. Then, in 1968, 23 years after the fire, a letter arrived. It was postmarked from Kentucky with no return address. Inside was a grainy photograph of a man in his mid-20s. The features were striking. He had the same dark eyes and nose as the Sodders. On the back, handwritten in a scrawl, were the words, "Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. I Lil Boys. A 90132. The family was electrified. It looked exactly like Louis would have looked as an adult. They hired a private investigator to go to Kentucky and find the man in the photo. The investigator took their money, left for Kentucky, and was never heard from again. He vanished, just like the children. George Sodder died in 1969, a year after receiving the photo, his heart broken. Jenny continued to wear black every day until her death in 1989. She tended the garden over the ashes of her home, never accepting that her children had died there. The billboard eventually fell down, and the site is now just a patch of grass. The youngest Sodder child, Sylvia, who was just a toddler during the fire, maintained until her dying day in 2021 that her siblings were kidnapped. She believed they were taken to Italy or perhaps sold into an illicit adoption ring, victims of a vendetta against her father. The Sodder Children mystery remains one of the most disturbing cold cases because it denies us closure. A fire destroys, but it leaves evidence. A kidnapping takes, but it leaves a trail. The events of Christmas 1945 did neither. They simply erased 5 lives from the earth, leaving behind only questions, a grieving family, and the haunting possibility that 5 children grew up somewhere else, perhaps never knowing that their parents died waiting for them.